السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد، قال الله تعالى في القرآن العظيم: إن عدة الشهور عند الله 12 شهرا في كتاب الله يوم خلق السماوات والأرض منها 4 حرم. صدق الله العظيم. Dear brothers and elders, alhamdulillah, we continue our series in which we talk about the important events that happen in the current Islamic month. As we know, last month we talked about Jumada Al-Ākhirah, talked about some important events that happened in that month. Alhamdulillah, the new month has started yesterday. Today is the 2nd of Jumada Al-Ākhirah. Alhamdulillah, I was able to sight the moon just coming out of the masjid. I just looked up and I saw the moon. Alhamdulillah. So we should try to make an effort, even if we don't go out, actually go into the mountains, and as some people do, that obviously would be best because fulfilling the sunnah and reviving the sunnah of moon sighting. But even if we cannot do that, at least we should figure out when is the 29th of each month, or even the 30th, so that we can think, that we can at least look in the sky and see if the moon is there. We can sometimes easily sight it, inshallah. So in Jumada Al-Ula, we already talked about the meaning of the word. Jumada Al-Ula just means the month in which water would become frozen because of how cold it was. And that the reason being that during that year, specifically when the months were named, then that was a very cold time of the year. Similarly, Jumada Al-Ākhirah as well. It's the second month with the same name. Al-Ākhirah just means the second or the last month that's named Jumada. So it's basically the same meaning as that month. So we're basically only going to go over 3 events this time, inshallah, as after Salat al-Fajr, sometimes it gets a bit difficult to go a bit longer. So one very important event that happened in this month, on the 21st of Jumada Al-Ākhirah, 13 years after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, was that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu passed away. And we all know that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was a very great Sahabi, an amazing life. He was actually known to be the greatest man to exist after the prophets. He had such a high status that he was the greatest man to exist after a prophet. Just think about that for a moment, what that means. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu has many virtues. We know that he was, if not the first, he was one of the first Muslims. There's some difference of opinion. He was the second in the cave, mentioned specifically in the Quran, in a context of praise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that he was with Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in the cave when they were doing hijrah and migrating to Medina. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam specifically chose him to be his companion. So many virtues that it would take, not even maybe just one program, multiple programs just to talk about his virtues and how great of a man he was. We just wanted to speak a little about not his entire life, but at least those 2 years after the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam passed away. We know that after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu became the Khalifa and leader of the Muslims. And so, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, after he became the Khalifa, he undertook such an amazing job, as we will see, that Islam was in a very difficult situation. The Muslims were in a very difficult situation after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. We know that the passing of the Prophet ﷺ was the greatest tragedy ever to befall this. We know that Anas radiallahu anhu actually mentions that when Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam came to Medina, when he made hijrah to Medina, then أَضَاءَ كُلُّ شَيْءٍ, everything became brightened. But the day that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam passed away, everything became darkened. And so the Muslims were left sort of in a state of confusion. We know that Umar radiallahu anhu, when he heard the news of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam passing away, he started getting upset that anyone who's saying that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has passed away, then I will chop off his neck or something along those lines. So everybody was in a state of confusion, and it was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu who gave his historic words, and he recited the famous ayah of the Quran that وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ, that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was only a messenger who had messengers who came before him as well. أَفَإِن مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انقلبتم على أعقابكم. If he dies or if he is killed, then will you turn your and turn back to what you had before, going back to disbelief? No, never. So saying these important words, these were actually ayahs of the Quran. The Sahaba were amazed and they were saying that it's as if we had never heard this ayah of the Quran before. So he had a very important role in consoling the Muslims after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, and explaining to them the reality that this deen will carry on. It is not dependent on Nabi ﷺ nor anybody, rather it is the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it will carry on until the day of judgment. And so we know that Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, the people gave him bay'ah and he became the Khalifa. And so at this point what was happening is that we know that the last couple of years of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, many people were coming into Islam, and many tribes, entire tribes were coming into Islam after they saw that the Muslims became powerful. And so we know that not all of these tribes were fully sincere in coming to Islam. Some of them just saw the power of the Muslims, they saw the power of the Prophet ﷺ, and they saw that, we should also accept Islam, just looking at everyone, just going with the flow, basically. So they did not have very deep-rooted iman in their hearts. So some of the tribes, actually, a large number of people, actually, when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, they thought, okay, now it was because of the Prophet ﷺ, because of his presence, that the Muslims got all of this power, that the Muslims got all of this land, and they had all this conquest, and we saw all the Muslims being so powerful and together. But once the Prophet ﷺ has passed away, now that power is gone. And so some of them started taking advantage. Some of them, they refused to give zakat anymore. They said, no, we will only give zakat to the Prophet ﷺ. We won't give it to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And some of them, they even started following another prophet. A few different people started claiming to be prophets. Al-Aswad al-Anasi, have Musaylim al-Kadhab and others. They actually started claiming to be a prophet after the Prophet ﷺ as well. And they started gaining followers as well. And similarly, some people, they left the fold of Islam, etc. And they rebelled. They wanted to rebel against the Muslims, and they even tried attacking Medina as well. So we see these huge now challenges facing Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. First of all, they just went through the most difficult phase in their entire lives. The Prophet passing away. Imagine the most beloved Prophet who was more beloved to them than their own selves and their own children, their own families, and all of their wealth. And then the Prophet has passed away. He was everything for them. He was their leader. He was he was their judge. Everything you could think of, every role, that was him for the Muslims, even to the extent that is mentioned that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is like a father for all the believers. And so now the Prophet, all the Muslim believers lost their father, they lost their leader. So they were in a state of confusion, and on top of that, now you have all these tribes that are taking advantage of the situation, and now they're sort of rebelling against what was going on, against Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So he consoled the Muslims, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu consoled the Muslims, and when he became Khalifa, he took control and took some very powerful steps in order to quell all these rebellions that were going on. But one important thing that was going on is that before the Prophet ﷺ passed away, right before that, he had gotten an army ready, consisting of Usama bin Zayd radiallahu anhu as the leader of the army. And then he had, I forgot exactly how many troops, but there were a solid number of troops that he was going to send to Sham, to obviously above the Arabian Peninsula. We have Jordan and Syria and Palestine, those lands. And that time that was being ruled by the Romans. So the Prophet ﷺ was sending an army to that area. And then the Prophet ﷺ passed away before the army could be sent. Now, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu knew that this order of the Prophet ﷺ is there, that this army has to go there. But the other Sahaba are telling Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, look at the situation has completely changed after the Prophet ﷺ has passed away. Now we see that there's so much rebellion going on. Now people are trying to take advantage of the situation, and they're trying to turn against the Muslims, turn against Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So Umar radiallahu anhu was actually even telling Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu that don't send this army, rather we need this army here so that we can take care of these other problems. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu refused. And he mentioned that this is an army that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself has commissioned, and I will make sure no matter what that this army will go out for its destination. And to the point where he mentioned that even if the dogs would come and drag the wives of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I will still make sure that this commandment of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is fulfilled, and I will send this army for the purpose that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent it. And so it seemed like it was against all odds. It wasn't making sense to the Sahaba. They were thinking that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was making a big mistake They're telling him to bring the army back. This is not making any sense. We need this army here. Even in Medina, we're so vulnerable. The tribes outside of Medina are ready to attack us. Now you're sending some of our strongest forces out, and you're trying to send them all the way to Sham. So everybody's thinking this makes no sense. But Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu knew the command of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam comes first. And if Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has decided something, then this is something that is best for us. And so he sent this army out. And what happens? We see the barakah of following the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the order of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He sent this army out. And what happened is that a lot of those tribes that saw that were thinking that now the Muslims are going to be weak because of the fact that the Prophet ﷺ passed away, they saw that, wow, they're sending an army. Not only are they sending an army, they're sending an army to the Romans, the superpower of the time. And so they started thinking, okay, let's see what happens when they come back. And when they came back victorious, the army was victorious by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they were amazed. They were like, wow, okay, so it seems like our judgment was wrong. It seems like Muslims actually do have a lot of power. And so a lot of them actually stopped their idea and they stayed upon Islam after that. So we see the barakah, even though it makes no sense logically to the Muslims at that time, but we see that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu had the most knowledge. This is why he was chosen to be a leader after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had the most knowledge of the deen. This was by consensus of all the Sahaba, and everybody knew that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the closest to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had the greatest understanding of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the deen, and so he knew that this army had to be sent no matter what. And we see the barakah of that. That a lot of the people that were thinking about rebelling, they actually stayed put and stayed in Islam. And so we see that Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he described the actions of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in such an amazing way, such a powerful statement he made. He said, Wallahi alladhi la ilaha illa hu, lawla anna Aba Bakr tukhlifa ma ubida Allah. And he said this 3 times. He said, Wallahi, by Allah, besides there is no God. Such a powerful statement. He's swearing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If it wasn't for the fact that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu took the reins after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if it wasn't for the fact that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu became the Khalifa after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then Allah would not be worshipped on this earth at this point in time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not be worshipped after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imagine how powerful of a statement that is. And we see how important Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was in the history of this ummah, and how indebted we are to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu for making all these amazing decisions and all these sacrifices for the sake of the deen. That Allah would not be worshipped on this earth if it wasn't for the actions of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And then after he mentioned this, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu explained the story of how Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu sent the army of Usama bin Zayd, and that was a means of quelling a lot of the rebellions. Even then, after sending this army, there was still some rebellions going on, as I mentioned, that there were some people who claimed to be prophets. And so what happened is that they're claiming that they're after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were prophets after him. And some of them actually reared their heads even at the end of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, Musaylama al-Kadhdhab, he reared his head. Obviously, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam refuted him, but still, some people amongst his nation followed him. And he actually even came up with some fake surahs and said that these are similar to the Quran, and he thought he brought something like the Quran. Yet those surahs now are read and they're looked at as laughing stocks. People read them and laugh at them, that they're so absurd and strange. He just tried to copy the style of the Quran, but the actual meaning and the content of those so-called surahs were so absurd and strange that until today people read them and laugh at them. So even the people of Musaylama who actually were following him, they knew that he was a liar, right? And he himself, of course, knew he was a liar, and even the people following him knew he was a liar, and that's why it was mentioned that the thing is, it was that aspect of tribalism and nationalism that came in, that they saw that we're from Yemen. He was in the area of Yamama, which is in current Yemen, and so they saw that he's from Yamama, and so the liar that is from Yamama is more beloved to us than the truthful one who is from Mudar, meaning from the area of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the tribe of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning it would be a tribalistic thing where these people were following Musaylama only because it was from their tribe and from their area. So anyways, so Musaylama and Al-Aswad Al-Anasi, these different people, they started prophethood. And so what happened is that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu sent armies to quell these rebellions, because at the end of the day, these were rebellions. And so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, at the end of the day, Sahaba, even though these armies were quite fierce, and especially in Yamama, in the battle with Musaylim al-Kadhab, a lot of the Sahaba passed away, and even a lot of the Prophet of the Quran, many of those who memorized the Quran, many of the Qurra from the Sahaba, they actually passed away in that battle. But at the end of the day, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and the Sahaba and the Muslims, they emerged victorious from all these different battles that were going on. On top of that, there was another fitna that I alluded to earlier, is that there were some people who stopped giving zakat. They started saying things like, if you give zakat was only to be given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has passed away, now there's no more zakat. So basically, they rejected a fundamental aspect of deen, and rejecting a fundamental aspect of deen is disbelief. And so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu mentioned that this is again also a form of rebellion as well, and disbelieving in the deen. And so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu sent expeditions against them as well. And slowly but surely we see that in those 2 years there was a lot of things going on in the Muslim Ummah. But at the end of the day, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he was able to quell all these fitnas, all these rebellions. And so that is when the empire of Islam, the Khilafah of Islam gained stability. And then that's after that we see, after Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu passed away, only a short 2 years and a few months after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. And then we see that that's when the Muslims had more stability. That's why Umar radiallahu anhu was able to take the reins and really grow the Muslim empire. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu regained the stability, and then Umar radiallahu anhu and Uthman radiallahu anhu after him and Ali radiallahu anhu, they were able to really expand the Islamic empire. And so that's when we see the lands of the Muslim empire really expand throughout the lands in Iraq and even to the west and to the east as well. So it was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu who laid the foundation stone for all of this to happen. One other extremely important thing that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu did for the deen in his khilafah in his short 2 years is that, as I mentioned, that many of the Huffaz and those who memorized the Quran, at that time, the main way that the Quran was preserved was through memorization. So many of the Huffaz, they actually started passing away in these different battles that were going on. And so Umar radiallahu anhu had this concern that all these people are passing, all of these Qurra are passing away. So we have to do something about preserving the Quran. Why don't we gather it all into one book? At that time, the Quran was not all gathered into one mushaf like we have today. Rather, it was completely written in the lifetime of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Every time any wahi, any revelation would come, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would order his scribes and they would write it down right on the spot. So the entire Quran was written in the lifetime of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. However, it was scattered amongst the different scribes and the different people, whoever had pieces and copies. And of course, then all the Sahaba and different the Muslims of that time, they memorized the Quran as well. And so that's how it was preserved, both orally and written. But it was not all gathered in one place in one mushaf. And so what Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu did is that he ordered Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu, a great Sahabi, a very knowledgeable Sahabi, one of the most knowledgeable Sahaba of the Quran. He was also a young person. He had many qualifications to do this job. And so he ordered Zayd radiallahu anhu to take this responsibility of gathering all of the parchments of the Quran, whatever the Quran was written on. Again, even paper at that time was very scarce. People were writing on things like, the skins of animals, the dried skin of animals and bones and everything they could find. They would write the Quran and all of these things. So his responsibility now was to go and gather all of these and put it into a book form and gather it all together into a mushaf. And on top of that, he had to make sure that for each of these, he had 2 witnesses that this was written in front of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And so it was a great effort that he did, and obviously Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu helped out as well. And in the end, we see that the first compilation of the Quran was done, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was responsible for gathering the Quran together in one compilation. There's a lot more details to the compilation of the Quran, how the Quran was preserved until today in such an amazing fashion that it's not changed at all. There's a very nice book that I would recommend if anybody's interested in the topic by Sheikh Mustafa Al-Adami, Dr. Mustafa Al-Adami. He was a traditional alim as well as an academic. He interviewed many Orientalists. He wrote a very good book called The History of the Quranic Text, in which he goes into great detail on discussing about how the Quran was preserved first in the reign of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and then the reign of Uthman radiallahu anhu, and then after that until today, how the Quran was preserved for us. And he even compares it He even compares it to the preservation of the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament, and explains how they were not properly preserved, whereas the Quran was preserved in amazing fashion. So the point is that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was firstly responsible for gathering the Quran all together in one compilation. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu immensely and amazingly for all the great work he did for Islam. Again, such an amazing statement by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. He said that Allah would not be worshipped today if it wasn't for the efforts of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And so we see that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu passed away during this month that we are going through in Jumada Al-Ākhirah. So it's a good time for us to remember his sacrifices, to try to read about his life and try to really emulate his model, because he was definitely an exemplary role model for the Muslim Ummah. Then another Sahabiya, great Sahabiya, radiallahu anha, none other than the actual daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Fatima radiallahu anha, was born. And so she was born in this month as well, in Jumada Al-Ākhirah. And she was born 5 years before the prophethood of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so she has many, many special qualities, and she was one of the beloved daughters of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam's lineage was actually continued through her only. The other children that he had through the other grandchildren he had through other children, they ended up passing away. But we see that the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was only continued through Fatima radiallahu anha. So that alone is such a great virtue of Fatima radiallahu anha. So anybody who is truly a Sayyid and a descendant of the Prophet today, all of their lineage goes through Fatima radiallahu anha. And so we see that she had Hassan radiallahu anhu, Hussein radiallahu anhu, Muhsin radiallahu anhu, Zainab radiallahu anha, and Kulthum radiallahu anha. These were her 5 children she had with Ali radiallahu anhu. We know that Ali radiallahu anhu, obviously another great Sahabi, the 4th Khalifa, the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he was the husband of Fatima radiallahu anha. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam specially chose him for her because he was his most beloved daughter, and so he chose such an amazing Sahabi like Ali radiallahu anhu to be her husband. And so even when she was young, Fatima radiallahu anha, when she saw that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the era of Makkah, she sees the Prophet ﷺ going through so much difficulty. She sees the Kuffar of Quraysh, doing such terrible things to him. For example, that famous story in which Abu Jahl takes the inside of a camel, the intestines of a camel, and puts it on the Prophet ﷺ's back while he's in sajda. It's so heavy that the Prophet ﷺ cannot even get up from sajda. It's such a terrible thing that they did in the Kaaba in front of everybody, humiliating everybody. She was the one who started yelling at them, and she pushed the intestines off them. She, basically defended the Prophet ﷺ's honor and defended the Prophet ﷺ in front of these terrible people. So this is obviously another great virtue that she had. And so Nabi ﷺ loved her to the extent that he actually said that Fatima bad'atun minni, that Fatima is actually a piece of my flesh, and whatever makes her upset makes me upset. And it's mentioned in some narrations that after the Prophet ﷺ would come back from any journey, first and foremost, he would come to the masjid, he would offer 2 rak'ah, and then he would sit there and be available for anybody if they have any questions or they want to meet him or something. Then after that, he would actually go to Fatima radiallahu anha's house first. Again, that shows the level of love that the Prophet ﷺ had for his beloved daughter, Fatima radiallahu anha. And we know that at the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, well, before we go through that, we see that the Fatima radiallahu anha had amazing sabr. She went through a very difficult life. Obviously, she lost her mother, Khadija radiallahu anha, at a young age. And obviously, all the difficulties all the Sahaba went through in Makkah, but especially the family of the Prophet ﷺ went through in Makkah. And she even lost the Prophet ﷺ. Obviously, that's the greatest loss that anybody could have. And then on top of that, she even lived a difficult life of poverty, even while she was in Medina. And there's a story mentioned in the hadith in which she felt shy to ask the Prophet ﷺ for a servant, but she needed a servant because of the difficulty she was going through. The work at home she was doing was literally making, marks on her hands. It was a very difficult situation financially for her and Ali radiallahu anhu. But despite all of this, she had sabr and patience, and she never once complained. And when the Prophet ﷺ told her that instead of giving you a servant, why don't I tell you the tasbih? As we know, the tasbih Fatimi, as we may know, the saying Subhanallah 33 times, Alhamdulillah 33 times, and Allahu Akbar 34 times before going to sleep. So this was given by the Prophet ﷺ to Fatima radiallahu anha as a remedy and a solution for her problem, that she feels tired, she has so much work to do. And so again, this we actually know this, we benefit from this because of Fatima radiallahu anha, and she chose that over getting a servant, and she did not complain about it at all. And so it is actually mentioned by Aisha radiallahu anha, who was obviously the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the beloved wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that that Fatima radiallahu anha was actually the most similar to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of character, in terms of the way she carried herself, in pretty much every single way. Fatima radiallahu anha was very similar to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so we see that at the end of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see that Fatima radiallahu anha comes in, and he gets so happy, and he tells her something in her ear, and she starts crying. And then afterwards, he tells her something else in her ear, and then she starts laughing. And so Aisha radiallahu anha asked her that, oh, what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tell you in your ear that you started crying? And then after that, why did you start laughing? She said that I cannot tell you the secret of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he has told me. Then later on, after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, this was the final days of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was literally about to pass away very soon after that. So after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, then it was found out that the Prophet ﷺ had told Fatima radiallahu anha that he will actually be passing away soon, and he also told her that she will be the first amongst his family to join him. And then after that, when she was crying, then he told her again in her ear that, doesn't it make you happy that you are Sayyidatu Nisa'i Ahlil Jannah, that you are the leader of all of the women of Jannah. Imagine Fatima radiallahu anha is a leader of all of the women in Jannah. And so doesn't that make you happy? And so she laughed out of joy when the Prophet ﷺ told her that. So from all of this, we learn the great status of Fatima radiallahu anha, and she was born in this month. And so we need to take her as our role model, and for ourselves, and as well as all of our family members as well. Fatima radiallahu anha is from the greatest of all role models, and she is from amongst the greatest women ever to step foot on the earth, to the point that the Prophet ﷺ actually mentions that these women, out of all the women of the entire world, are enough for you. And one of the women he mentions is Maryam alayhi salam, and another is Fatima radiallahu anha. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward her abundantly for all her sacrifices for the deen, and for all of the comfort she gave to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And finally, I wanted to go over the death of Harun al-Rashid rahmatullahi alayhi. He was one of the Khulafa, and he passed away in the year 193 after Hijrah on the 3rd of Jumada Al-Ākhirah. Again, in this month, he passed away. So who was Harun al-Rashid? We may have heard his name before. He was the 5th Khalifa of the Abbasid dynasty. So we know that after the Khulafa Rashidin, that the Khulafa Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Umar radiallahu anhu, Uthman radiallahu anhu, Ali radiallahu anhu, Hassan radiallahu anhu, all of them, their Khilafah took up about 30 years after the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after those 30 years, it was the Umayyad dynasty. Banu Umayyah had their dynasty for about a century and a half. And then after that came the Abbasid dynasty, the Abbasiyun. And so Harun al-Rashid, he came about 123 years after Hijrah, or he passed away 193 years after Hijrah. And he was the 5th Khalifa of this Abbasi dynasty. So what was so special about Harun al-Rashid? What set him apart from all the other Khulafa that came before him? So basically his father was also a Khalifa, and his father had made sure that he had the best of all upbringing. He raised him up so that he can be a ruler in the future. And so he got the best of all the ulama, and he had his child, he had Harun alayhi, study under the best of all the ulama. And so in terms of ilm and spirituality, he had that type of upbringing. On top of that, he would send him to the expeditions with the greatest of all the commanders so that he can gain that ability to lead the ummah when the time comes. And so he had this great upbringing, and for that reason we see that he was a very special Khalifa. And so we see that during his rule, knowledge actually advanced a lot, and there was a lot of ilm, and he commissioned a lot of books being translated, etc. So there was a lot of work going on in terms of ilm during his rule. And also the most wealth gathered in Baytul Mal in Islamic history during his reign. And this was without any oppression. Obviously, sometimes there would be oppression. Rulers would would gather people's wealth without their permission and for no reason. But, however, Harun did not do oppression. Rather, he had gathered about $400 million of today's dollars worth of money in the Baytul Mal, in the treasury, and this was spent on benefiting the Ummah. And so we see that during his reign, canals were built, roads were built, masajid were built, beautiful palaces were built, and this obviously was a means of advancing the civilization of the Muslims. And we see that Baghdad actually became the center of trade in Asia. And we also saw a great population growth as well during his reign. And so he accomplished a lot in a short time. There were also some political rebellions, so we quashed those rebellions as well. And so he actually became a leader at the tender age of 25. And again, I mentioned this last month as well, but it comes up over and over again. We see that the 25-year-olds of that time were not just kids, trying to find their feet in life and trying to figure out what's going on. The 25-year-olds of that time were conquering nations. The 25-year-olds of that time were literally running entire countries. Whereas today, 25-year-olds, they're still figuring everything out. So we have to really try to teach ourselves and our children that, once we reach the age of puberty, this is the time where we need to really start taking responsibility for ourselves and for others as well. And so we see that Harun rahmatullah alayhi, he accomplished all of this in a very short period of time, because he only passed away at the tender age of 43. So imagine these 18 years, at the age of 43, all these things that I'm mentioning to you, he accomplished all these, and he passed away at the age of 43, such a young age. So we see that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can put so much barakah in someone's lifetime. If somebody takes advantage of their time and they use every single minute, there's some ulama also, they've written, literally no exaggeration, hundreds of books, and they pass away at the age of 40, at the age of 50. People become shocked that, first of all, they gain so much ilm. It takes a long time to gain such a vast number of amount of ilm that you can write so many books. So how did they gain that knowledge? And then on top of that, have the time to write all these books. On top of that, they had the time to take care of all their daily needs. And on top of that, they even had students that they would teach throughout the day. So where did they get all this time? It's barakah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you take advantage of your time, and you see that Allah puts a lot of barakah in your time, you are able to accomplish much. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all to follow these exemplary role models. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله